Hello boys and girls, this is Professor Nelson from Electronics speaking. Aren't you tired of your soldering iron not lasting long enough? And of the tip of your soldering iron being covered in soot which prevents you from making a good solder? Well, on this occasion I'm going to teach you how to extend the useful life of your soldering iron and to keep the tip shiny so you can make excellent solders. Without further ado, let's watch the video. Well, for this task we're going to need the following components. A common 1 amp diode. This one here is the 1N4007, which is more than enough for our 60-watt soldering iron. A 3 amp switch, which is also more than enough for our project. Very well, the circuit we're going to use is this one here. We're going to cut the soldering iron cable, in which we're going to place a diode, and the switch in parallel to the diode. One of the soldering iron wires will go directly to the connector. Without further ado, let's put together the circuit. First, we'll take apart the soldering iron. There you can see that we have 2 wires, of which we'll have to cut one to be able to place the diode. And the switch in parallel. We won't touch the other. In this case, we'll leave the blue one unmodified, and we'll cut the brown one. Well, the intention is to place the diode right there and connect it to the other missing wire. Placing the anode towards the connector and the cathode towards the missing wire. In the case of the switch, we are going to place it in parallel. We are going to place this with 2 cables. As you can see, we are going to solder 2 cables to the diode. To solder the switch in parallel, it would look very good like this. Here we can see that we have the 2 red cables at the ends of the diode. Now we are going to bend the ends of the diode to put pressure on the copper filaments. Then we are going to put a little tin on both ends. And finally, we are going to place the heat shrinkable cable to insulate those terminals. Now we place the heat shrinkable cable. Don't forget that the anode is on this side and the cathode on this side. Now we are going to solder the switch. The order of the cables doesn't matter. You just have to solder them directly onto the switch pins. But before doing the soldering, keep in mind that the terminals are very long. So we are going to bend them, or cut them to make them shorter. Very well, our switch would look like this. Now let's move on to soldering. We've now got our switch soldered. Remember, it is in parallel to the diode. Now before installing the circuit to the soldering iron, we are going to do some tests and see how the circuit works. Very well, guys, now we are going to test the operation of our soldering iron using an oscilloscope. To do this, we are connecting the probe exactly to the blue cable and to the cathode of the diode. Here we will put the probe of the oscilloscope, and we will see the signal. What signal are we going to receive? Well, we will have two signals. These two signals are the ones we will apply to our soldering iron. The first is the signal that is always present in the power outlets, which would be 100% of the signal. This signal will generate 100% of the power in our soldering iron. For example, if our soldering iron is 60 watts, then we will have 60 watts. This with the switch closed. If our switch is closed, all the current will pass through the switch to the soldering iron. However, if the switch is open, the current will have to pass through the diode to the soldering iron, which will give us only 50% of the soldering iron's power. So we have two signals. With the switch closed, we will have 100% of the power. And with the switch open, only 50% of the power, since the diode will only let half of the signal through. So let's see that with the oscilloscope. There we have the 100% signal. That is, 100% of the power is being applied to our soldering iron with the switch closed. We are going to open the switch and see how only half of the signal reaches it. There we have half of the signal, that is, 50% of the power of the soldering iron. In this way, you can reduce the power of your soldering iron. If it is 60 watts, it will be 30 watts. If it is 40 watts, it will be 20 watts. And this will allow us to have greater control over the temperature, preventing the soldering iron from overheating and soot from being generated on the tip of it. Very well, without further ado, let's move on to assembling the circuit in our soldering iron. Now we are going to make a hole for the switch on the soldering iron. But be careful not to cut the cables that are inside. Ready? Now we move on to assembly. We are going to put all this in, being careful with these two cables, since we have to solder these two cables to the switch. But first we have to put everything in. But don't forget to clean everything first. Okay guys, now you might have to cut some of the plastic, so your switch can fit completely into our soldering iron. So now we can put it in place. Ready now, we can put our switch in. We solder it and put it in. Ready now, we put it in the hole. Okay, now we have our soldering iron ready. But if necessary, put glue on it. In my case, it is pressure fitted. Now remember that when the switch is open, you will have half the power. If you close the switch, you will have full power of your soldering iron. So let's test it. Okay, guys, now to check the status of your soldering iron, we are going to use the diode multimeter. First, we have this circuit where we have the switch and the diode in parallel. Therefore, we are going to have the following operation. On this occasion, I have the switch open, so the current would go through the diode and would pass to the resistance of our soldering iron. Therefore, the reading should be that of a diode plus the value of the resistance of the soldering iron. Therefore, we see here 1055, which would be greater than that of a diode. This means that it is fine. Now we are going to close the switch and the reading value should decrease. That value there is the resistance value. Since the switch has just been closed, all the current passes through the switch to our soldering iron. Now what happens if I reverse the tips of the multimeter? Well, in this situation, it should measure the same. Inverted the tips, and we have a reading similar to the previous one. Now we are going to open the switch, and it should not measure anything. There you can see that the reading is a very large value. It means that in this case the positive is connected here, and the negative is connected to the diode. Therefore, no current passes, and therefore it means that our diode is working well. This is a way to test it with the multimeter before plugging it in. Well, since the modifications are very good, now you can use the soldering iron. Let's try it for a while and see the results. Very well, guys, to finish now, your soldering iron has two functions. The first is at maximum power, and the other at half power. If your soldering iron is cold, you can press the switch and it will heat up much faster. Once you reach the maximum temperature, press the switch and you can work at half power. You can use this with much smaller components which do not require much temperature, such as integrated circuits, resistors, and diodes. However, if you are going to work with larger components, then you will need more temperature or more power. In that situation, you will have to press the switch and let much more current or power pass. And this way you can solder those larger elements. Once you finish soldering, don't forget to open the switch so that the tip of your soldering iron doesn't generate soot, and so that your soldering iron doesn't overheat. This way your soldering iron will last much longer working at half power. Well, this concludes the video. But first, I wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And if you like the video, don't forget that a like helps the channel a lot. See you in the next video. Bye-bye.